Spirit, and help us to conclude our thoughts and to be aware of your message to us. Lord, that we may profit from your ministering to our hearts. Give us a receptive spirit as we ponder on your word. In the conclusion of the Gospel of the beloved disciple, we have these rather quaint words. This disciple is the one who vouches for these things and has written them down. And we know that his testimony is true. He goes on to say, there was much else that Jesus did. If it were written down in detail, I do not suppose the world could ever hold all the books that would be written. It occurred to me that a good place to pause as we return to words and noise and movement is precisely to evaluate the power of the word. It concerns us all. We have just read words that come from the first century. The Greek of John is sometimes fairly simple, indicating its antiquity and also possibly its Semitic origin, as would make sense. But words come through in translation. They work, they warn, they orientate, they convert. Our words can do the same. With regard to John himself, there was the original conclusion a little earlier, and we know that chapter 21 is an afterthought. The first conclusion, as rather actually in the Gospel of St. Mark, finishes with the shock. The shock and the news of that. There's so much in the air with regard to what happened that there's no need to write it down. But as time went on, they perceived that the more that was kept in writing, the more safe it was. But I want to look into the question of books, but also for us, their equivalent. Much of the New Testament is actually in epistolary form. Epistolography is a whole study. In fact, we did a course on that one time in classics. It's as ancient as the hills. Letters. There is one of those famous Dutch paintings, actually, called The Letter. And there's suspense in the air. You can see these young ladies there, I think by a piano, and this letter is being read. There's an awe of waiting, and everyone wants to know what's in the letter. The receiving of a letter was a huge event. Indeed, it was a huge event until very recently. I remember one time when I was at home, my brother, who was older than I was, this gentleman arrived at the door. It was in the days of telegrams. They were important in those days, and it was a message from Oxford that he'd had an exhibition there to Jesus College. And so that was a shock to the whole family, but it was a physical object arriving and being awaited. And we have lost that. We have lost that to our own detriment. I'll try and explain in a few stages what has happened and what is happening to us. In days of old, a letter was meant to last. At last it did. When we were clearing up the things of my parents after the last one to die, we came across very old letters. Some things were going back to their courting days, very moving. But letters were meant to last. eventually were printed. And at the university at Bangor we had all his letters in volumes and volumes and volumes. And somebody who became a Catholic at university when I was there, Carol her name was, did her research on Newman, going through all these letters. And she was scribbling away and fascinated to talk to her. She got to know him through his letters. And writing a letter is a sign of care. That person means enough to me to dedicate time to that person and to write a letter which I am giving attention to. And by the way, one tends to write a person a letter when that person has already written to us a letter. So it's therefore a calm reception of the person. And if you look carefully, letters say a lot between the lines. Nowadays, one still gets letters from convents and monasteries, convents especially, because they have no other means of communication, and their whole heart is in that letter. But one also is pleasantly surprised to see how, especially if one invokes the Holy Spirit before writing, a word can have an effect. When eventually, first of all, the telephone came in, the classic telephone, it wasn't everywhere, many families didn't have a telephone for a long time. That was already a beginning of a change. However, because it was only one line in a house, if one had one at all, and it wasn't so simple in the beginning, a telephone call also was an important event. It's not quite so private, but there was also an act of giving time and of listening. I open a parenthesis. If one looks carefully at one's inside, one will discover a secret. As in hearing confessions, if one is in a classical box, or even not, but closing one's eyes, one hears far more than when one is looking at the person, because there's no distraction and one hears the person's heart and the words between the lines. I spend most of my time hearing confessions in a classical box, at least on a weekend, that's where it happens. And one hears very well. It also is more expeditive, one doesn't waste time, because there's a whole lot of people waiting, it's better for that point. And I close that parenthesis that the act of listening also on the phone can be more intense if one is closing one's eyes and really listening. And also, there is a whole way of listening which actually is fairly concrete. Have you noticed that if you are in this position, tendentially one will not speak until one knows what one wants to say. One will give the person the space to get to the end of all that that person wants to say. There's nothing more dysfunctional than interrupting before the person has got to what the person actually wants to say, because otherwise one is answering a preamble. So this secret, the trick, listening in that mode, is very effective. It encourages us not to take the first move of opening the lips, which is already a poise, and it's only one small step then before engaging a conversation. But this slight protection is actually in the Psalms, Pone Domine custodiam ori meo, place a guard over my lips. And it's a method actually of going through life in general which obverts certain unprepared reactions. The immature and uncontrolling person has no mental filter. All that passes there comes out there. We need to be in control of every word. Why? The person who hasn't uttered a word in his mind is still all-powerful over what may or may not happen. Once it's out, you'll never call it back, for better or for worse. Words can do an awful lot of damage when not thought. That, by the way, is a help when comparing the slow, ponderate, safer method of writing and weighing before one actually sends it off. Right, the telephone then comes in and lasts a good long time until our generation, when the telephone itself is brought to another level. When we each eventually, not in monasteries necessarily, but in society as a whole, tend to have an individual phone, which actually has an advantage of not having to, for instance, answer the phone for somebody else. In a monastery, that's happening all the time. Classically, one answers the phone for somebody else. At least they've only got you. But many things have come in the wake of that. You're always available. That was not the case with the fixed phone. One could get away. Now, that is to be borne in mind. It's a conscious choice to be or not to be available at any given time. People have no right to presume that they can get us immediately. That was never ever the case in human society in the past. It doesn't have to be right now. There are then the updating of phones to the present stage. I haven't got that, but most people seem to have it. A phone which has also all the rest, internet and all that goes with it, attached. They use it for all kinds of things, even to get from A to B as a sat-nav. So they have it on. Now, do you see what's going on there? They don't actually want it for the phone, but it's on for other reasons. So also, if they're not careful, they're available all the time. It's because it's not been thought out. It's a choice which then is going to change their life forevermore. They'll always be available. Now, that is drawing their availability away from something else, e.g., the person right there before me. It's extremely rude to be interrupted by somebody else and to give that person automatically the precedence after an appointment made with the person before one. So it's devastating depth of quality of conversation. Also, it's devastating quite a few relationships. Another stage, the text. It came fairly soon after the mobile phone became generalized. The text has the advantage of not consuming extra time in a long, irrelevant conversation. It can be useful for getting to the point immediately. However, it has led to this B side of cheap communication, immediate answers. It means short message service, SMS, and is designed for an immediate answer, short and sweet, but once one starts on that, very quickly, if one is not careful, one goes into what they call text tennis, which can't stop. And they're usually difficult to stop. Multiply that by several of them going on in the same moment, you're going to go a lot of time on these bleeps to see what the last one is. And people are actually now finishing off the day with catching up on these, just in case there's something important coming in. Even in marriage, taking this important contraption into bed. Now, do you think that's going to help deep relationships? That's all in our pocket, wherever we are. You look around, people have killed any boring moment by immediate cancellation of it. They all, once they've got a second, waiting for something, take out that. And in university, it's changed completely. When last time I was at university, it wasn't that long, mid-90s, humanities, that wasn't there yet. And we had quality time, which is part of my education, of knowing how to dialogue with anyone about any subject. That's completely now reversed by each one going to the coffee room with his little bubble. You watch them, they're all communicating there, but not with each other. And suicide, where's that come from? Because then we've got now another stage where, whether on their smartphone or elsewhere, they've got gradually increasing, more complex modes of communication, which are devastatingly absorbing. Social media and channels of communication which are ever more profound and repetitive and demanding, even amongst the clergy. What's going to happen? Bit by bit, the itch is going to be addictive. It's a new, psychological, and profound addiction. Now, in retreat, we've got to hit this head on. It's threatening us all to some extent. I chose from the beginning not to have internet in the house, but I had to have it for YouTube, but that's different, that's outgoing. But the whole thing of all these things coming in and out all the time and draining into that also is going to make us less able to engage in a profound thought process, either with a book, either with writing a paper, either with adoration, because our head is too full, and we might even have a beep going off in our pocket if we're not careful, or with other people in depth, because there are too many of them, most of them virtual. Do we want it, or do we not? Now, it's kind of important, because the choice is never consciously made. In retreat, we can. For the rest of my life, who is in control? Am I or am I not in control? It takes a mature decision to actually take the things in our hand and say, I will not always be sacrificed to virtuality. I just want to conclude with something which goes back a good while now, but indicates what a letter could be still, and how important it was that things arrived way back, and how they changed lives. You can think of this the next time we take the pen, and address a word to a heart, invoking the Holy Spirit for a word that will heal and orientate well in His name. You may or may not receive letters still with the words S-A-G on them. I still quite often receive them, and I didn't know what it meant until I was given the explanation in this account. And it's a true story, so listen and we'll finish with this. The origin of the practice is this. A Spanish merchant named Antonio Dante left Spain for South America in 1729 to establish a business in Lima, Peru. His wife, who remained in Spain, wrote a number of letters to him, without receiving a reply. In great distress and with the utmost simplicity, she brought a letter with her to the church of St. Francis at Oviedo. In the church was a large statue of St. Anthony, and it was in his outstretched hand that she placed a letter to her husband. The prayer of confidence was, St. Anthony, I pray thee, let this letter reach him, and obtain for me a speedy reply. The next day she returned to the church and saw that the letter was still there. Weeping in frustration that the letter had not been delivered, she attracted the attention of the brother sacristan, who listened to her story. Afterward, he told her that he had tried to remove the letter, but could not. He told her, he asked the lady if she would try to remove it. she did with ease. The letter was not the one placed the day before in the saint's hand, but a letter from her husband. Immediately, 300 golden coins fell from the sleeve of the statue. A number of the friars were alerted to the scene and waited while the miraculous letter was opened. The letter was dated July the 23rd, 1729, and read, "My dear wife, for some time I have been expecting a letter from you and been in great trouble at not hearing from you. At last your letter has come and given me joy. It was a father of the Order of St. Francis who brought it to me. You complain that I have left your letters unanswered. I assure you that when I received none, I believed you to be dead. So you may imagine my happiness at the arrival of your last one. I answer by the same religious and send you 300 golden crowns, which will suffice you for your support until my approaching return. In the hope of soon being with you, I pray God for you, and I commend myself to my dear patron, St. Anthony, and ardently desire that you may continue to send me tidings of yourself. Your most affectionate Antonio Tante." The original letter, written in Spanish, is preserved in Oviedo. In memory of this event, the practice of writing S.A.G. St. Anthony Guide, means St. Anthony Guide, on letters became widespread. Little stamps were also manufactured, and still are, which display a likeness of St. Anthony and the three letters. These stamps are fixed to letters placed under the saint's patronage. So, my friends, letters are powerful. Years ago, I was coming out of the Welsh Mass at home, in the place where we had it every month, and it was in a country church. My spiritual father, our chaplain, who was he was an Irishman who spoke Welsh, out of his pocket pulled a letter and told me in Welsh to read it. I hadn't a clue he'd written to the Premonstratensians, but this letter came from the abbey in Ireland where eventually I was sent. And I thought, wow, this letter has come out of the blue. It's a hint. If you want to save your vocation, we'll take you. The abbot is in Wales right now. Go and visit him if you want to. I thought, what a choice here. Is this just an accident?